Hello, my friends, and welcome to Night Whisper. This is a quiet place where we drift together into an unanswered sky slowly, calmly, and without fear. Here, we don't rush toward conclusions. We listen, we observe, and we let the mystery breathe. If these stories bring you a sense of calm or keep you company through the night, you're always welcome to stay with us. Subscribing gently helps this space grow, and it allows more quiet minds to find their way here. You can also leave us off, like if the story helps you relax, unwind, or feel less alone beneath the night sky. And if any thoughts rise as you listen, you're welcome to share them in the comments below. Some mysteries don't arrive with noise. They appear quietly, in a place where the forest is still, the water barely moves, and the sky seems to be watching. Tonight's story takes us back to a remote lake in Canada, a place where one ordinary morning slowly turned into one of the most unusual encounters ever reported beneath the open sky. A man walked into the wilderness looking for simple stones, but what he found instead was something that would stay with him for the rest of his life: a silent craft, a burst of heat, and a mystery that never truly left the forest. For decades, the land itself seemed to remember that moment. The marks remained. The questions remained, and the quiet mystery of Falcon Lake still whispers through the trees. Chapter 1. The Quiet Forest and the First Whisper. Far in the eastern wilderness of the Canadian province of Manitoba lies a place where time seems to slow down, a place where the air carries the scent of pine trees, and where the quiet is so deep that even the smallest sound can feel meaningful. This place is Whiteshell Provincial Park, a vast landscape of forests, lakes, and ancient stone. If you were to walk through this park at dawn, you would notice something immediately. The world there does not rush. The wind moves slowly through the tall trees. Small waves rippled gently across the lakes. Birds drift across the sky like quiet messengers of the morning. Everything feels peaceful, but sometimes the quietest places hold the deepest mysteries. Long before cities existed, long before highways crossed the land, the rocky ground of this region was already old. The stones beneath the forest belonged to a formation known as the Canadian Shield, one of the oldest geological landscapes on Earth. Some of these rocks have existed for nearly 2 billion years. Imagine that for a moment. 2 billion years of storms, seasons, glaciers, and sunlight slowly shaping the land. It is the kind of place that makes people wonder what secrets might still be hidden there. And on a warm spring day in 1967, one man walked into this ancient landscape expecting nothing more mysterious than an ordinary day of exploration. His name was Stefan Michalak. To those who knew him, Stefan was a practical and hard-working man. He lived in Winnipeg, the nearest major city, where he worked as an industrial mechanic. His job required careful thinking and patience. Machines do not tolerate guesswork, and Stefan had spent years learning how to understand them. People trusted him because he was logical, methodical, the sort of person who liked clear answers. But even practical people need quiet moments away from the noise of daily life. For Stefan, those moments were found in nature. Whenever he could take time away from work, he would travel east toward the forests, near Falcon Lake there. Among the rocky hills and hidden lakes, he could pursue a hobby he deeply enjoyed: amateur geology. He loved searching for mineral deposits, not for fame or fortune, but for curiosity. There is something deeply satisfying about discovering patterns hidden inside the earth. Sometimes a simple crack in a rock can reveal a sparkling line of quartz. Occasionally, careful searching might even reveal traces of valuable metals like silver. For someone with patience, the forest could feel like a giant puzzle waiting to be explored. Stefan approached these trips the same way he approached his mechanical work, with quiet focus and steady curiosity. His equipment was simple: a hammer, a chisel, a compass, and a notebook. Nothing complicated, just the tools of someone who enjoyed learning what the land could reveal. And so, on the morning of May 20th, 1967, Stefan once again made the journey toward the wilderness he loved. It was the long weekend celebrating Victoria Day, a time when many Canadians took short vacations to enjoy the early warmth of spring. The winter snow had finally melted away, and the forests were coming back to life. Birds were returning to the skies. The lakes were clear and calm, The air felt fresh and alive. To Stefan, it seemed like a perfect day to explore. He drove toward Falcon Lake early that morning, passing small towns and winding roads until the busy world of the city faded behind him. Soon the landscape changed. Thick forests replaced farmland. Rocky hills rose between quiet lakes. Eventually, he reached the familiar trails leading into the wilderness. Stefan had visited this area many times before. In fact, he had recently staked a small mineral claim nearby, believing the rock formations there might contain promising quartz deposits. So after packing his car, he gathered his tools and began walking into the forest. The ground beneath his boots was uneven, covered in patches of moss and stone. Sunlight filtered through the branches overhead, creating moving patterns of light and shadow on the ground. As he walked deeper into the trees, the sounds of the outside world slowly disappeared. No engines, no voices, just wind, water, and birds. It was exactly the kind of peaceful place Stefan had hoped to find. Soon he reached the rocky outcrop, where he had previously discovered a quartz vein. The pale mineral lines running through the stone glimmered faintly in the sunlight. Kneeling beside the rock, he took out his hammer and chisel and began carefully tapping along the surface. The rhythm was slow and steady. Tap, tap, tap. Each strike echoed softly through the clearing. For a while, nothing unusual happened. Stefan focused entirely on the rock in front of him, examining the patterns of mineral lines and cracks. Occasionally, he paused to wipe dust from the surface or jot notes into his small notebook. It was the kind of quiet work that allowed the mind to wander peacefully. Perhaps you've experienced moments like that yourself. Moments when the world feels calm and simple. Moments when time seems to drift gently forward without urgency. But sometimes, the calmest moments are only the beginning of something unexpected. Because deep in the forest, changes can arrive quietly. Often, the first signs are noticed, not by people, but by animals. If you have spent enough time in nature, you might recognize this pattern. Suddenly birds stop singing, or a deer freezes and listens, or a flock of birds lifts into the sky. In sudden alarm, animals sense disturbances long before humans understand what is happening. And that afternoon, something unusual stirred in the forest. Stefan noticed it first as a sound, a loud, sudden burst of honking overhead. He paused and looked up. A flock of geese was rising rapidly into the sky. Their wings beat the air urgently as they flew away, calling out in sharp, anxious cries. It was strange. Birds sometimes react to predators or unexpected movement, but this felt different. For a moment, Stefan simply watched them climb higher and higher until they disappeared above the trees. Then his attention shifted because something else had caught his eye. Something unusual in the sky. At first it looked like a distant reflection, perhaps sunlight bouncing off an aircraft far away. But as Stefan focused on it, he realized there were actually two objects there, two shapes hovering silently above the forest. They were far enough away that their details were difficult to see clearly. But their movement, or rather, their lack of movement, felt strange. They were not traveling across the sky the way airplanes normally do. Instead, they seemed to be simply hovering, floating quietly in place. Stefan stood slowly, shading his eyes with one hand as he looked upward. What could they be? Weather balloons, military aircraft, perhaps experimental technology being tested somewhere nearby? The 1960s were a time of rapid aviation development. After all, new aircraft designs were constantly being explored. Still, something about these objects seemed unusual. As he continued watching, the sunlight shifted slightly on. Suddenly the shapes became clearer. They were long and smooth, almost like two glowing cigars suspended in the sky. And finally, they appeared to glow with a reddish-orange light. Stefan felt a ripple of curiosity. The forest around him had become strangely quiet. The geese had disappeared. Even the wind seemed softer. For several moments, he simply stood there watching the two distant shapes. Then something changed. One of the objects began to move. Not quickly, not dramatically. It simply began descending toward the forest. Slowly. Carefully. As it drifted downward, Its shape seemed to shift slightly in the changing light. What had appeared long and narrow at a distance now seemed wider, almost circular, like a metallic disc reflecting the afternoon sun. Stefan's curiosity grew stronger, because whatever he was seeing, it was coming closer. Closer to the clearing where he stood among the ancient rocks of Falcon Lake. Closer to the quiet place where only moments earlier he had been peacefully searching for quartz. And although he did not realize it yet, that quiet moment would soon become the beginning of one of the most mysterious encounters ever reported in Canada. As the strange glowing object continued its slow descent toward the rocky clearing, Stefan Michalak stood perfectly still beneath the open sky, watching, waiting, and wondering what, exactly, was about to land in the silent forest beside him. And in the quiet wilderness of Falcon Lake, the mystery was only beginning. And so, drawn by curiosity and a love for the quiet forest, Stefan prepared for a journey that would... Chapter 2. A man who trusted machines. Long before the strange lights appeared in the sky above Falcon Lake, the life of Stefan Michalak followed a steady and predictable rhythm. It was a kind of life built on routine, responsibility, and quiet determination. Stefan lived in the busy Canadian city of Winnipeg, a place known for its wide streets, long winters, and hard-working people. Winnipeg in the 1960s was a city that moved with purpose. Factories hummed. Mechanics worked in garages. Workers traveled back and forth between jobs and homes, building their lives day by day. And among those workers was Stefan. He was an industrial mechanic, a profession that required patience and precision. Machines, after all, are not forgiving things. If something breaks or stops working, there is always a reason. A loose bolt, a worn gear, a small misalignment that grows into a larger problem. Stefan liked that about machines. They followed rules. They behaved according to logic. And if you studied them carefully enough, you could usually understand why they behaved the way they did. That mindset shaped the way he looked at the world. He was not someone who rushed to strange conclusions. If something unusual happened, he preferred to look for practical explanations first. Friends and family often described him as thoughtful and disciplined, the sort of person who observed quietly before speaking, the sort of person who believed that careful investigation was always better than wild guesses. But like many people who spend their working lives surrounded by tools and machinery, Stefan also needed time away from the noise and motion of the city. And when he wanted quiet, he traveled east, out toward the forests, toward the rocky wilderness surrounding Falcon Lake. There, the busy world faded away. Instead of engines and factories, there were pine trees and open skies. Instead of crowded streets, there were winding trails and quiet lakes. And most importantly, for Stefan, there were rocks. To so many people, that might sound like an unusual hobby. After all, rocks are everywhere. Most of us step over them without thinking twice. But to an amateur geologist, rocks are like pages in a history book. Each layer tells a story. Each mineral line reveals something about the powerful forces that shaped the Earth long before humans existed. And the rocks around Falcon Lake were particularly interesting. The region lies within the ancient formation known as the Canadian Shield. It is one of the oldest pieces of the planet's crust, stretching across vast areas of Canada. Some of the stone in this region formed nearly 2 billion years ago. Imagine that. 2 billion years of geological history preserved beneath your feet. For someone curious about minerals, it was a fascinating place to explore. Quartz veins often appeared in the exposed rock formations, sometimes sparkling brightly in the sunlight where the stone had cracked open. Occasionally, prospectors even discovered traces of silver hidden among the minerals. Stefan was not searching for great wealth. He simply enjoyed the process of discovery. There was something calming about walking through the forest, scanning the rocks, and wondering what might be hidden beneath the surface. Sometimes he would spend hours examining a single outcrop, tapping gently with his hammer and carefully studying the patterns revealed inside the stone. Those quiet moments felt very different from the fast-moving world of machines and factories. In the wilderness, time moved slowly, and that was exactly what Stefan appreciated. He often traveled alone on these prospecting trips, not because he disliked company, but because solitude made it easier to concentrate. When you are searching for subtle mineral patterns, distractions can easily break your focus. So he would pack a few essential tools: a hammer, a chisel, a compass, and a notebook and head into the forest. Simple equipment, simple goals, just a quiet search for interesting formations. Over time, Stefan became familiar with the terrain around Falcon Lake. He learned where the rocky ridges rose from the forest floor and where promising quartz veins had appeared before. Eventually, he even decided to stake a small mineral claim in the area. That meant he believed the land might hold valuable deposits worth exploring further. Of course, staking a claim did not guarantee success. Many prospectors spent years searching before finding anything significant. But for Stefan, the journey itself was part of the reward. The forest offered something the city could not. Space to think. Sometimes he would pause during his walks and simply listen. Wind brushing through pine branches, water lapping against the shore of a quiet lake, birds gliding silently overhead. Moments like that made the world feel larger and calmer. It is easy to forget how powerful quiet can be. In the city, our attention is constantly pulled in different directions. Noise, traffic, conversations, flashing lights. Everything demands focus at once. But in the wilderness, attention returns to simpler things. A sound in the distance, the pattern of sunlight on the ground, the slow rhythm of breathing as you walk along a forest trail. For Stefan, those trips to Falcon Lake were almost meditative. He could leave behind the complexities of machinery and human schedules and reconnect with something older and quieter. And yet, despite all his time exploring those forests, he had never encountered anything truly mysterious there. Not until that spring of 1967. Even then, when the events of that year began, Stefan did not immediately assume anything extraordinary was happening. That is important to remember, because when the strange objects appeared in the sky above Falcon Lake, Stefan's first instinct was not fear, and it certainly was not the idea of something otherworldly. His first instinct was to understand the situation in practical terms. Maybe it was a new type of aircraft. The 1960s were an era of rapid technological development. Engineers and military researchers were constantly experimenting with unusual designs, vertical takeoff vehicles, experimental jets, strange prototypes that sometimes looked nothing like traditional airplanes. If something like that had landed in the wilderness near his prospecting site, it might explain the unusual shapes he had seen. Perhaps the pilots needed assistance. Perhaps it was simply a mechanical test flight. Those thoughts seemed far more reasonable than anything mysterious. And so, when Stefan noticed the glowing objects hovering above the forest that day, his curiosity was guided by the same mindset that had shaped his entire life. Observe first. Investigate carefully. Understand the machine. That approach would soon lead him closer and closer to the strange object resting on the rocks near his prospecting site. But what Stefan could not yet know was that this encounter would challenge everything he believed about machines, technology, and the predictable logic of the world. Because whatever had descended into the clearing that afternoon did not behave like any machine he had ever seen. It hovered silently. It glowed with an unusual light, and it seemed to respond to the world in ways that felt unfamiliar. Still, curiosity is a powerful force. It can pull a person forward even when uncertainty grows. So while the forest remained quiet around him, Stefan slowly began to move toward the rocky clearing where the strange object had landed. Each step carried him deeper into a mystery that would one day capture the attention of investigators, scientists, and storytellers around the world. And somewhere high above the treetops, the sky watched silently as a practical man who trusted machines prepared to examine something that might not follow the rules of machines at all. And in the stillness of the forest, curiosity quietly guided his next step. Little did he know, the forest held a presence that would reveal itself in ways no one could have imagined. Chapter 3. The day the sky changed. Morning arrived slowly over the forest surrounding Whiteshell Provincial Park. The first light of day crept gently across the treetops, turning the dark green pines into soft shades of gold. Mist hovered above the lakes like a thin blanket, drifting quietly across the water before the warmth of the sun could lift it away. It was the kind of morning that feels calm before you even step outside. If you had been standing there at dawn, you might have heard the distant call of loons echoing across the water. You might have seen the ripples spreading slowly across the surface of a quiet lake, as a fish moved just beneath it. Everything about the forest felt peaceful, still, patient. It was May 20th, 1967. During the long weekend celebrating Victoria Day. For many people across Canada, it was the perfect time to escape the city and enjoy the first warm days of spring. Families packed their cars and drove toward campgrounds. Fishermen prepared their boats for early morning trips across quiet lakes. Hikers laced their boots and headed into the forests. But for Stefan Michalak, the day began with a very specific plan. He was returning to the rocky hills near Falcon Lake, where he had previously discovered a promising quartz vein. The area had caught his attention during earlier prospecting trips, and he believed the rocks there might still hold interesting mineral formations, perhaps even small traces of silver. For Stefan, this was not an unusual adventure. He had visited the region many times before, always carrying the same simple equipment: a hammer, a chisel, a compass, and a small notebook for recording observations. His approach to prospecting was patient and methodical. He was not rushing to strike riches. Instead, he studied the land carefully, examining the cracks and patterns in exposed rock faces. Sometimes the process felt almost like solving a puzzle. Each line in the stone hinted at ancient forces that had shaped the land. Each mineral vein revealed something about the history of the earth itself. That morning, Stefan packed his tools and began the familiar drive out of Winnipeg. The city gradually disappeared behind him as the roads grew quieter and the forests thicker. Soon the wide streets of the city gave way to narrow highways winding through rocky terrain and dense trees. The further he traveled, the quieter the world became. Eventually, he reached the area where he planned to explore that day. Parking his car near a trailhead, he gathered his equipment and began walking into the forest. The ground was still slightly damp from melting snow earlier in the season. Patches of moss covered many of the rocks, and sunlight filtered gently through the branches above. The walk felt familiar and peaceful. Birds moved through the trees. A cool breeze drifted through the clearing. For a while, the world felt perfectly ordinary. Stefan followed the trail until he reached the rocky outcrop where he had previously found the quartz vein. The pale mineral lines were still visible across the surface of the stone, glimmering faintly in the sunlight. Kneeling beside the rock, he set down his tools and began working. Tap, 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 tap. Steady sound of hammer against chisel echoed softly across the clearing. Small fragments of stone chipped away, revealing fresh surfaces beneath. This kind of work requires patience. You cannot simply strike a rock with force and expect it to reveal anything useful. Instead, each tap must be controlled and careful, following the natural cracks in the stone. Stefan focused completely on the task. Time passed quietly. Minutes stretched into hours. The sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the clearing around him. Occasionally he paused to wipe dust from the rock surface or examine a newly exposed mineral line. Sometimes he wrote a quick note in his notebook. It was exactly the kind of quiet, methodical work he enjoyed. But deep in the forest, subtle changes can occur without warning. Sometimes they begin with the animals. You may have experienced this yourself if you have ever spent time in a remote place. Birdsong suddenly fades. Small animals disappear. The forest becomes strangely quiet. Often these changes happen before humans understand why, and sometime around midday, as Stefan continued working at the quartz vein, something unusual disturbed the calm of the forest. The first sign came as a sudden burst of noise overhead. A flock of geese erupted into the sky. Their wings beat the air rapidly as they flew away, honking loudly in what sounded almost like alarm. Stefan stopped working and looked up. For a moment he simply watched the birds climbing higher above the trees. It was unusual. Geese sometimes take flight suddenly, but this felt different. Their movements seemed frantic. Their calls echoed across the clearing as they disappeared into the distance. Stefan stood slowly and brushed dust from his hands. Something about the moment made him curious. He followed the direction of the bird's flight and looked up into the sky. At first he saw nothing unusual, just pale blue sky stretching across the horizon. Then he noticed something small and distant. Two bright shapes. They hovered far above the forest, almost like reflections of sunlight. Stefan squinted slightly, trying to focus. Were they aircraft? Weather balloons? It was difficult to tell from that distance. But something about their movement, or rather, their stillness felt strange. Airplanes rarely remain perfectly still in the sky. Yet these shapes seemed to hover quietly above the trees. For several moments, Stefan watched them. Gradually, their shapes became clearer. They were long and smooth, almost like two glowing cigars suspended in the air. And faintly, they seemed to glow with a reddish-orange color. Stefan felt a flicker of curiosity. Perhaps they were experimental aircraft. The 1960s had become an era of rapid aviation development, and unusual designs were constantly being tested. That explanation seemed reasonable enough. But then something happened that made the situation even more unusual. One of the objects began descending. Slowly, carefully. It moved downward, toward the rocky clearing not far from where Stefan stood. As it came closer, the sunlight revealed more details. The long shape appeared to widen slightly. What had looked narrow from a distance now seemed more circular, almost like a disc. The surface reflected light in a strange metallic sheen. Stefan remained perfectly still, watching. The forest around him had grown very quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. The glowing object drifted lower and lower until it hovered just above a flat rock formation nearby. Then it settled onto the stone surface with a faint hissing sound. A wave of heat rolled gently across the clearing. The air shimmered slightly above the rock, almost like the heat rising from pavement on a summer day. Stefan stared in amazement, because whatever he was seeing, it was clearly not behaving like an ordinary airplane. The second object remained in the sky above for a moment longer. Then it tilted slightly, and suddenly it accelerated away, disappearing into the distance with incredible speed. Now, only one object remained, resting silently on the rock outcrop just a short distance away. Stefan stood alone in the clearing, surrounded by ancient stone and quiet trees. His first instinct was not fear, it was curiosity. Machines fascinated him, and this was certainly some kind of machine. Perhaps an experimental aircraft, perhaps a prototype vehicle being tested somewhere nearby. Whatever it was, it had landed unexpectedly in the forest. And if that was the case, perhaps its pilots might need help. So slowly, carefully, Stefan began walking toward the strange object resting on the rocks. Each step carried him closer to something he did not yet understand. Closer to the source of the unusual heat drifting through the clearing. Closer to the mystery that would one day become known around the world as the Falcon Lake incident. And although Stefan could not possibly know it at that moment, the quiet decision to approach that strange machine would soon lead him into an encounter unlike anything he had ever experienced. Because the object resting on the rock was not silent for long, and the next moments would change his life forever. As Stefan stepped closer to the strange craft, the forest seemed to grow even quieter, as though the ancient wilderness itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The rustle of leaves, the startled cries of birds, signals of a visitor approaching, unseen yet profoundly felt. Chapter 4. The birds that knew first. The forest seemed to pause in anticipation that day. Every rustle of leaves, every ripple across the lake, felt amplified, as if the world itself had sensed something unusual was about to unfold. Stefan Michalak stood still, the sunlight warming his shoulders, eyes fixed on the strange disc-shaped object resting on the rock outcrop just ahead. The second craft had already disappeared into the sky, leaving him alone in a clearing that had once been just another quiet part of the forest. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, adjusting the strap of his briefcase and gripping his hammer. He reminded himself, this could be some experimental aircraft, a prototype, perhaps. That explanation made sense. Machines have rules. Machines can be studied. Machines can be understood. But this object, silent, glowing, seemingly alive in its stillness, defied the expectations of any aircraft Stefan had ever known. Then, before he could take another step, the forest spoke in a language only the attentive notice. A flutter of wings, sharp and sudden, erupted from the trees nearby. Birds leaped into the sky in a chaotic rush, their honking cries slicing through the calm. The noise was startling, but Stefan had long learned to respect the reactions of wildlife. Animals often notice shifts in the world that humans cannot. What did they know that he didn't? The geese seemed terrified, climbing high above the treetops, circling briefly before disappearing over the ridge. Their frantic flight was almost a warning, a signal from the forest itself. Stefan paused, instinctively shielding his eyes from the glare of the sun, and tried to make sense of it. Could animals sense things humans cannot? Could they perceive changes in the air, vibrations, or electromagnetic energy that escaped ordinary notice. It was a thought that would linger with him for years to come. He shifted his gaze back to the object. It was closer now, perhaps 30 or 40 meters away, resting silently on the flat rock. Its surface shimmered with a metallic sheen, catching the sunlight in a way that made it look almost fluid. There were no visible seams or rivets. The edges were smooth, precise. Stefan leaned forward slightly, squinting, trying to discern any markings or features that could provide a clue. And then he saw them. Small vents, arranged in a precise grid-like pattern on the underside. A faint glow seemed to pulse from within, almost imperceptibly, like the slow heartbeat of some machine or something else entirely. A low hiss escaped from the object intermittently, so subtle it might have been imagined, but Stefan felt the heat it radiated, brushing against his face and making the hair on his arms stand on end. Curiosity urged him closer. He had seen strange things in the skies before: fireballs, experimental aircraft, unusual clouds, but nothing that left a heat signature, nothing that hovered in such a controlled, deliberate way. His mind raced with possibilities. Was this technology from a nearby military test site? Was it some experimental Canadian craft? Or had he stumbled upon something no one on Earth could explain? Stefan moved carefully across the rocky terrain, each step deliberate. The ground was uneven, scattered with loose stones, moss, and the occasional hidden root. Each careful footfall seemed magnified in the still air, echoing faintly off the surrounding rock faces. As he approached, a faint odor reached him, a sulfur-like temps that made the back of his throat tingle. It was not overwhelming, but it was enough to make him pause. Machines rarely smell this way. Engines, turbines, or any conventional machinery had distinct odors. Oil, fuel, hot metal. This was different, something organic, almost alive, yet mechanical at the same time. Stefan crouched slightly behind a boulder, observing. The object didn't move. Its glow remained steady, its surface smooth, as though it were waiting for him or perhaps waiting for something else entirely. He noticed that the shadow it cast was sharper than the sun should allow, the air around it shimmering slightly, as if it were bending light in an unfamiliar way. And then, almost imperceptibly, it tilted. A vent on its underside shifted slightly, releasing a whisper of warm air. Stefan felt the current brush against his face, carrying the faint scent again. He couldn't explain it, but instinctively he stepped back, realizing the object was not entirely inert. The birds had known. They had sensed the heat, the energy, the disturbance in the air, and now Stefan could feel it too, though he could not yet identify the source. Slowly, almost tentatively, he stood upright. His hand brushed against the strap of his briefcase, then the handle of his hammer. He reminded himself of his training, his experience with machines. Observe, analyze, understand. The same methodical approach he had used for years with mechanical problems might work here. Perhaps understanding this object required only patience and attention. As he inched forward, the sunlight glinted off a small detail he had not noticed before. Tiny markings like hitchings were scattered along the side of the object. They were subtle, geometric, almost artistic in their precision. Stefan wondered briefly if they were functional, a part of the craft's design, or simply decorative. He took another careful step forward. The heat radiating from the craft grew more intense. His skin tingled where it was exposed, even through his shirt. The warmth was steady, but not unbearable. Yet beneath it lay something else. An energy he could not measure, something that seemed to vibrate in the air itself. Stefan paused. He had been a mechanic for decades, trained to understand forces, pressures, and thermodynamics. But this was unlike anything he had studied. No engine he knew could hover with such stability, produce heat in this pattern, and emit a sound so soft, yet so alive. And then the forest seemed to hold its breath. Even the distant birds, long gone, felt like ghosts of a warning still lingering in the air. The leaves stopped rustling. The wind held its path. Time itself seemed too slow. Stefan realized he was standing at the edge of something extraordinary, something that would not only challenge his understanding of machines, but would also mark a moment in history, a moment where ordinary life brushed against the unexplained, the unknown. He raised a hand slowly, as if to signal the object. Perhaps it would respond. Perhaps not. He had no way of knowing, and yet he felt compelled to continue, drawn forward by curiosity, stronger than caution. He was a man who trusted machines. He believed in logic, in understanding, in careful observation. And he was about to confront a machine, or a presence, that would challenge everything he had ever known about the natural world, the mechanical world, and the boundaries between the two. The sun continued to move across the sky. Shadows lengthened, and in the quiet clearing near Falcon Lake, a man prepared to step closer to a mystery that no one had yet been able to explain. The forest remained still, and for the first time that day, Stefan felt a ripple of wonder tinged with the smallest whisper of fear, because the forest had known all along, even if he did not. Chapter 5. The descent. The world around Falcon Lake seemed to hold its breath that afternoon. Stefan Michalak stood among the ancient rocks, the sunlight glinting off the glistening quartz veins, and the air carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. But all of that, the forest, the lakes, the wind, felt distant somehow, as if his attention had been drawn to a single point, the strange glowing object hovering just above the rock outcrop. It had been floating there for several minutes, still, silent, and impossibly precise. Stefan's heart beat a little faster, though he hardly realized it. Not fear, curiosity, but a deep, primal awareness that this was not ordinary. Machines, even the most advanced ones he had worked with, did not behave like this. They did not hover effortlessly, adjust their balance without sound, or radiate heat in such strange, almost purposeful ways. And then it moved. At first, the movement was subtle, a tilt, a gentle rotation, almost imperceptible. The object seemed to shift as if weighing its surroundings, its unseen sensors, or mechanisms, silently assessing the forest, the rocks, and the man approaching. Stefan instinctively stepped back, feeling the warmth increase slightly as the craft tilted toward him. It was as if it acknowledged him, not consciously, perhaps, but in some physical, energetic way that he could feel in the air. The sulfur-like scent grew stronger, carrying with it a tingle on the back of his neck. His hair stood slightly on end, and he felt the faintest hum in the soles of his feet. Something was moving, and it was precise, deliberate. Then, slowly, the craft began its descent. Not a rapid fall, not a clumsy drop. It moved down as if guided by invisible hands, sliding through the air with effortless control. The red-orange glow that had marked its presence in the sky seemed to intensify, bathing the clearing in a soft, unearthly light. Shadows stretched and shifted, reflecting off the surrounding rocks and trees in strange patterns, like the forest itself was being rewritten under this glow. Stefan crouched slightly, unsure whether to continue forward or hold his ground, but curiosity, that unrelenting force, urged him on. The object's descent was mesmerizing. Its edges, so smooth, so clean, seemed almost liquid in the sunlight. He could see the faint outline of vents along its underside, arranged in a perfect grid. Heat radiated from them, but not in the uneven, chaotic way a fire might. This was controlled, purposeful. He thought back to the countless machines he had worked with during his career. Air compressors, engines, turbines, industrial lifts, all predictable, all bound by known forces. Yet here was something that seemed to defy all of it. It hovered without wings, without visible propulsion, without sound. How could a machine like this exist? How could it move like this? The object continued its descent, now just a few meters above the rocky clearing. Stefan could see every detail more clearly. The metallic surface shimmering with a subtle sheen, the precise grid pattern of the vents, the soft glow pulsing within, and then he noticed something more. A hatch-like opening forming briefly along one edge. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Stefan saw it. His mind raced. Was this a door? A window? Something else entirely? He wanted to step closer, but the warmth radiating from the craft's surface reminded him to be cautious. The air shimmered faintly above the vents, and he could feel the energy rolling toward him in a tangible way. It was warmth, but not ordinary heat. Something deeper, more concentrated, almost alive. The craft continued its descent until it finally touched the rock outcrop with a faint hiss. The sound was soft, almost like a breath escaping through a narrow opening. The heat intensified, radiating outward, brushing against Stefan's face and arms. The object had settled, perfectly balanced on the uneven surface of the rock, as if it had been designed to rest there. And then, as if testing its new environment, the craft made a subtle adjustment. The vents tilted slightly, and a thin column of warm air escaped, creating a ripple in the surrounding atmosphere. The smell of sulfur grew stronger, and Stefan could feel the energy in his chest, an almost magnetic pull drawing him closer. He froze for a moment, absorbing everything. The light, the heat, the smell, the quiet of the forest, broken only by the distant whisper of birds or the soft rustle of leaves. He realized that he was standing in front of something entirely unlike any machine he had ever known. It was precise, controlled, and yet alive in a way he could not articulate. Stefan took another careful step forward, his eyes tracing the surface of the object. It was disc-shaped now, wider than it had appeared from a distance. The metallic sheen was unlike any metal he had seen, smooth and reflective, but with subtle variations that made it seem almost organic. The heat from the vents brushed his gloves, causing him to pause. A single touch might reveal something, he thought. Just one careful touch, and then he noticed movement. From within the hatch, he thought he heard a faint, muffled sound. Not mechanical. Not like a machine. It was almost human-like, a faint murmur that seemed to echo from within the metallic interior. Stefan's mind raced. Was someone inside? Were they human? He couldn't tell. The sound was soft, almost deliberately subtle, and it disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. He tried to speak, first in English, then in other languages he knew. Russian, German, Ukrainian, Polish. Hello. Can you hear me? His voice sounded small against the vastness of the forest. There was no response, only the soft hum of the object, the gentle hiss of heat escaping the vents, and the faint pulsing glow. Curiosity pulled him closer. He extended a gloved hand toward the craft, wanting to feel its surface, to confirm it was real. The moment his glove touched the metallic exterior, he felt its intense heat. The tips of the glove began to melt almost instantly. Stefan recoiled, startled, but also fascinated. No machine he had ever touched behaved like this. No metal had ever radiated such concentrated energy. The object had landed quietly, but now it was alive in a way he had never imagined. Its heat, its subtle movements, and the energy in the air suggested a power beyond comprehension. It was as if the craft itself was aware of his presence, responding to it in subtle, physical ways. Stefan stepped back, processing everything. He had approached it carefully, methodically, using the logic and patience he had learned from years of working with machines. But this object did not obey the rules he knew. It was something else, something beyond understanding, at least for now. He took a deep breath, feeling the warmth ripple across his chest and arms. He realized he was on the threshold of a mystery that would forever change his life. The forest remained quiet around him, holding its breath along with him. Even the distant sounds of water and birds seemed muted, as if the entire wilderness was aware that something extraordinary had arrived and was resting quietly on the rocks. And in that moment, Stefan understood something subtle but profound. The forest, the geese, the rocks, the wind, they had all been warning him, guiding him toward this moment. The birds had known before he did. The forest had sensed the presence of something unusual. And now, standing just meters away, he was facing a craft unlike anything humanity had ever documented. A machine that hovered effortlessly, glowed softly and radiated a kind of heat and energy that defied explanation. Stefan took another cautious step closer, his mind alive with questions. What was it? Who had made it, was it, even from this world? And in that silent, sunlit clearing, surrounded by ancient stone and whispering trees, the craft seemed almost to wait for him to find the answers, or perhaps to acknowledge that some mysteries could not be answered easily at all. The descent was complete. The object had landed, and the moment of truth, the first step into the unknown, was about to begin. The forest remained still, as though holding its secrets in quiet anticipation, while Stefan stood at the edge of the unimaginable, reeling from the sudden blast Stefan stumbled back, unsure if he had glimpsed a miracle or a danger beyond comprehension. Chapter 6. The Silent Machine. The clearing felt suspended in time. Stefan Michalak, S-boots pressed against the rocky ground, but each step seemed unusually heavy, as though the forest itself had thickened the air around him. The glowing disk rested just a few meters away, radiating a heat so intense it made the air shimmer like a mirage. For a man who trusted machines, this object defied every rule he had ever learned, yet his curiosity refused to let him turn back. He approached, slowly, every movement deliberate. His gloved hand tightened around the hammer he carried, though he knew it was more a comfort than a tool. The warmth rolling from the object made his arm tingle. The sulfur-like scent in the air grew stronger with every step. It was subtle at first, almost sweet, then slightly acrid, lingering in the back of his throat. Could it really be a human-made machine? He whispered to himself. Could someone have built something like this? The forest answered only with silence. The birds had long since fled, leaving the clearing eerily still. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though holding its breath. The disk's surface gleamed metallic, smooth and unbroken. There were no seams or bolts to suggest ordinary engineering. Its glow pulsed softly, almost rhythmically, like a heartbeat beneath the metal skin. Stefan crouched slightly, examining the grid-patterned vents on the underside. Each tiny square seemed perfectly aligned, precise beyond anything he had encountered in human engineering. Then he heard it. A sound, faint and muffled, almost beneath hearing. A soft murmur that seemed to emanate from inside the craft. At first, he thought it was the wind, or perhaps the rocks shifting under the weight of the object. But as he listened, it repeated, subtle yet deliberate. He whispered his own voice into the clearing. "Hello." No response. He tried again in Russian, German, Ukrainian, Polish languages he had studied in his youth, hoping, perhaps, that if there were anyone inside, they might understand. Still, nothing. Only the soft, humming warmth from the vents. Stefan swallowed, feeling a mix of caution and fascination. His first instinct was mechanical. Observe, test, touch. Machines? Obey rules, he reminded himself. Perhaps there was a way to understand this. He reached out, gloved hand trembling slightly, and touched the side of the disk. Immediately, a wave of heat surged through the glove. It was not just warmth. It was searing, concentrated, almost living. The glove tips began to melt, sticking faintly to the smooth surface of the metal. Stefan pulled back instinctively, blinking against the brightness of the glow. "What kind of metal is this?" he murmured. "It shouldn't behave like this." His eyes roamed over the entire object. It was disc-shaped, wider than he had imagined, smooth, and almost organic in appearance. It seemed to shift subtly under the sunlight, the reflections changing as he moved. The heat radiated in patterns he could almost feel on his skin, pulsing like a silent heartbeat. Stefan noticed the hatch again. It had opened slightly, a brief triangular slit along the edge, releasing a gentle waft of heated, sulfur-scented air. He could feel it brushing against his face, and it carried with it a strange, electric-like tension that made the hairs on his arms stand up. The vent beneath it pulsed faintly, as though the craft itself were breathing, preparing for something. He leaned closer, heart pounding, but did not touch again. Logic told him to be careful. Machines, even ones built by humans, can be dangerous. Yet every fiber of his curiosity urged him onward. The clearing felt smaller, tighter. The forest seemed to press in around him, and the rocks beneath his boots were uneven, grounding him as he focused on the machine before him. Each detail revealed new mysteries. The gleaming metallic sheen, the perfect grid of vents, the subtle pulsating glow, the warm hiss escaping in faint waves. It was all precise and controlled, yet undeniably alive. And then, without warning, the disk shifted, not violently, but with a subtle tilt. The vents beneath it opened wider, releasing a concentrated burst of hot air. Stefan felt the force push against him, lifting the tips of his shirt and brushing the cap on his head. The heat was intense, sudden, and raw, like standing in front of an open furnace. His mind raced. Machines don't behave like this. No human-made craft could suddenly release such concentrated energy and remain perfectly balanced on uneven rock. It was not just unusual, it was impossible. Yet, Stefan could not retreat. The logic and patience he had used all his life demanded observation. He moved just a step back, steadying himself, and tried to understand the energy radiating from the craft. He could see faint patterns in the heat above the vents, subtle, shimmering shapes that suggested an internal mechanism far more advanced than anything he had ever seen. For a moment he thought of the geese again. The birds had sensed this before he did. Perhaps the forest itself knew. Perhaps it was warning him in ways humans could not perceive. The hatch opened slightly wider, and a wave of warmth, tinged with the faint sulfur smell, rolled out. Stefan raised his hand slowly, almost in a gesture of greeting. "Hello," he said softly, as if speaking to a creature rather than a machine. The craft remained silent. No response, no movement beyond the subtle tilting and pulsing of its vents. Yet Stefan could feel it observing him, or something about its presence communicating in ways he could not measure. Then he made the first physical connection again. Carefully, he extended a gloved finger toward the glowing metallic surface. The instant he made contact, he felt an intense energy surge through the glove. It was hotter than any metal he had ever touched, concentrated and sharp, yet controlled. The glove started to warp, tives melting almost instantly. Stefan jerked back, astonished. The heat had been almost unbearable, yet he felt compelled to understand it, to explore further. This was no ordinary encounter. He could feel it in his chest, in the way the warmth pulsed against his skin, in the faint vibration beneath his boots. This was a machine, but also something more. Something that followed rules he did not know, yet seemed deliberate, intentional. Almost alive. Stefan took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. Every instinct he had learned from decades of mechanical work urged him to observe, analyze, and respect the forces at play. Yet even as he did, a quiet tension hummed in the air, like the moment just before lightning strike. He glanced around the clearing. The forest remained silent, as though holding its breath. Shadows stretched long across the rocks. The sunlight glinted off the quartz veins beneath him. The birds, now far above, had vanished entirely. Stefan realized that the moment he had stepped into this clearing, everything ordinary had slipped away. There was only him, the ancient forest, and this strange, glowing disk, silent, yet commanding, hovering just above the rock, radiating energy, life, and the unknowable. He took another careful step forward. Closer. Closer to understanding, or perhaps closer to a moment he could never predict. The forest seemed to lean in, and the clearing itself seemed smaller, tighter. Time slowed. Every breath, every heartbeat, every subtle shift of light felt amplified. And Stefan knew, deep in his chest, that he was on the threshold of something extraordinary. Something that would challenge every expectation, every assumption, every lesson he had learned about machines, physics, and the natural world. The silent machine waited, and Stefan Michalak, man of logic and curiosity, prepared to step even closer into the unknown. As the forest grew quiet once more, the story was only beginning. Official eyes and careful hands would soon arrive to document every detail. Chapter 7. The Moment of Fire. The sun had climbed high above Falcon Lake, and the warmth of a quiet spring afternoon had settled over the forest. But in that clearing, among the ancient rocks and whispering pines, the heat Stefan Michalak felt now was unlike any ordinary sunlight. It came from the glowing disk, humming softly, pulsating with a controlled energy that seemed almost alive. He had been observing the craft for several minutes, careful, cautious, trying to understand its patterns, its glow, its strange, almost breathing presence. Every instinct told him to respect the unknown, to step back. And yet, something in him, a mixture of curiosity, determination, and the human drive to understand, kept him moving closer. The craft tilted subtly again, as though it were assessing him, weighing his presence. The vents along the underside released another puff of warm air, brushing against his gloves. Stefan could feel the intensity of the heat in his chest, in his arms, and his skin. It was focused, controlled, yet undeniably powerful. He swayed, taking a slow breath. Machines are predictable, he reminded himself. They follow rules. They obey the laws of physics. But this did not obey the rules, he knew. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, it happened. The vents opened wider, and a sudden, concentrated burst of energy shot downward. It was not a gentle heat this time. It was a force, a wave of fire-like warmth that exploded from the grid-patterned exhaust. Stefan felt it before he even realized what was happening. His shirt caught instantly, the fabric sizzling where the energy touched it. His cap smoldered at the brim. The heat seared his chest and abdomen. He stumbled backward, reflexively shielding his body. But the force of the blast pushed him hard across the uneven rocks. The world spun for a moment, the sunlight blinding against the metallic sheen of the disk. Pain lanced across his torso, sharp, immediate, undeniable. The craft hovered silently above him, glowing, steady, almost as if nothing had changed. There was no roar, no dramatic liftoff, no chaotic movement, only the quiet, unyielding presence of the machine and the trail of fire it had left on Stefan's clothing. He landed on the rocks, dazed, smelling the acrid temps of sulfur in the air, feeling the warmth radiate even through his skin. His gloved hands burned slightly from earlier contact. His chest tingled painfully where the blast had struck, and the faint grid-patterned burn of the vent's release was already visible on his shirt. For a moment, Stefan simply lay there, catching his breath. His mind raced. Machines, even dangerous ones, usually gave warning signs. Pistons, engines, exhausts. They have sounds, vibrations, delays. But this had been instant, immediate, calculated. Yet it had not moved toward him in a traditional sense. It had simply unleashed energy in a precise, unyielding line. Slowly, carefully, he rose to his knees. The pain in his chest was sharp, but the forest seemed quieter than ever. Even the wind had stopped, leaving only the heat and the faint sulfur temps hanging in the air. Stefan's shirt had burned in places, the fabric charred, yet beneath it, his skin bore the first signs of the unusual, grid-like burns that would later become the hallmark of this encounter. His mind tried to make sense of it. What kind of craft could produce such concentrated energy without collapsing under its own forces? How could something hover so silently, emit such power, and remain perfectly balanced? And most importantly, why had it directed this blast at him? There was no aggression, he realized, only energy, controlled and precise. The craft did not move forward, did not chase him, did not attack. It had released the energy, and that was that. Almost like a machine testing the boundaries of its environment. Or perhaps testing him. Pain surged through Stefan again as he stumbled toward the rocks behind him, trying to put distance between himself and the object. The heat continued to radiate faintly, brushing the air around him, shimmering like waves above a desert road. Even at a few meters away, the warmth was tangible, making his skin tingle and his chest ache. He tried to calm himself. Breathe. Think. Machines obey rules, Stefan reminded himself. They follow logic. There must be an explanation for this. Yet in that moment, as he clutched his chest, smelled the faint sulfur, and felt the lingering heat on his burned shirt, he realized something subtle but profound. He was dealing with something beyond ordinary machines, something that obeyed principles he could not yet understand, yet was undeniably precise. Slowly, he looked back at the craft. It was steady, serene in its glow, almost indifferent to the damage it had caused to his clothing and skin. The vents emitted a faint residual warmth, pulsing softly in the late afternoon sunlight. The metallic surface shimmered like liquid metal, smooth and perfect. It was beautiful in a terrifying, awe-inspiring way. Stefan realized that whatever this object was, it was deliberate, controlled, intelligent, or at least capable of actions beyond the scope of ordinary physics. He took a cautious step back, feeling the burn on his chest and abdomen pulse painfully with every movement. He could taste the faint sulfur in the back of his throat, smell the char of his own clothing, yet he could not look away. Curiosity, stronger than pain or fear, compelled him to stay. Then he noticed the hatch again. It had shifted slightly, opening just enough to let a faint breeze escape, carrying heat and that sulfur-like smell. Stefan's gloved hand itched to touch it again, to see if this subtle movement would respond to him, as though the craft were inviting him to test its boundaries. But he hesitated. Pain reminded him of caution. Logic reminded him of self-reservation. And yet, the pull of understanding, of witnessing something beyond human experience, was irresistible. The forest remained still, holding its secrets, as Stefan knelt on the rocks, examining the damage to his clothing, the strange burn patterns, the way the heat lingered like a living thing. His breathing slowed, matching the rhythm of the craft's soft glow, and he realized he was in the presence of something that would forever change his understanding of machines, energy, and the boundaries between the known and unknown. It had landed. It had tested him, and in that moment Stefan Michalak understood that this encounter would mark the beginning of a journey. He could never have predicted a journey that would take him through pain, mystery, investigation, and ultimately, questions that had no simple answers. The disc remained silent, hovering quietly above the rock, indifferent yet precise, while Stefan clutched the burned remnants of his shirt and stared at the strange machine. And in that quiet forest clearing, the moment of fire had passed. But the story of Falcon Lake was only beginning. While investigators measured soil and burns, the whispers of the forest began to reach the wider world. Chapter 8. The Flight and Retreat. The clearing felt strangely empty after the blast. Stefan Michalak's chest burned where the hot exhaust had struck, and his shirt was charred in a precise, grid-like pattern, a mark that would stay with him for weeks to come. For a few moments, he simply knelt there, trying to catch his breath, feeling the lingering warmth brushing against his skin like a soft, invisible hand. The forest had returned to quiet. No birds, no wind, only the faint rustle of leaves in the distance. Yet Stefan could still feel the energy of the craft pulsing in the air around him. It was subtle, almost hypnotic, a gentle vibration that reminded him the machine, or whatever it was still there, still alive, still observing. Slowly, he realized he needed to put distance between himself and the object. Not out of fear, exactly, but for clarity. He had to think, to process, to survive the encounter in one piece. Every instinct he had developed over decades of working with machines, of troubleshooting and observing, screamed at him to retreat carefully. As he rose to his feet, the craft shifted again. This time, it moved with deliberate purpose. The glowing disc lifted from the rock, its metallic surface catching the sunlight and reflecting it in dazzling streaks. It hovered for a moment, as if measuring the forest, the terrain, and Stefan's position. Then it began to ascend, slowly at first, before accelerating silently into the blue sky above. No sound accompanied its departure. No roar of engines or mechanical hum. Just a soft, almost imperceptible pulse as the object gained altitude. The sunlight glinted off its surface, momentarily blinding Stefan as it rose higher and higher. The air where it had hovered shimmered in the residual heat, bending light in strange, undulating patterns. Stefan staggered back across the rocky terrain, glancing repeatedly at the sky as the disc disappeared into the distance. The forest remained silent around him, holding its breath in the wake of the extraordinary event. He realized that, in the span of mere minutes, his ordinary day of prospecting had been transformed into something completely inexplicable. He touched his burned shirt again, the grid-pattern burns pressing faintly against his skin. His chest tingled, a combination of pain and lingering heat that would not fade for hours. The sulfuric scent still lingered faintly, mingling with the earthy aroma of moss and pine. Every step he took across the uneven rocks felt surreal, like he was moving through a world slightly offset from normal reality. Stefan's mind was racing. He tried to reason it out. Perhaps it had been a secret military craft, a test vehicle from somewhere in the region. But the precision of the landing, the hovering, the heat, and the silence machines of that era did not behave like this. No aircraft, no prototype. No engine could move with such perfect control and produce such effects without making noise or visible exhaust. Even as he struggled to make sense of it, another thought struck him. What if this wasn't human at all? The idea seemed impossible at first. Humans did not possess technology like this, at least not publicly. But the evidence was undeniable. Stefan had seen the object with his own eyes, had felt the heat, had smelled the sulfur, had been burned in a precise pattern matching the vent grid on its underside. There was no ordinary explanation that could account for everything he had just experienced. He stumbled down the rock formation toward the forest path, his chest aching with every step. The forest seemed to press in around him, its shadows stretching as the afternoon sun began its descent. Each rustle of leaves, each bird call, in the distance, felt amplified, as if the wilderness itself were holding the story in quiet witness. Stefan's thoughts drifted back to the geese, those first frantic birds that had signaled something unusual even before he had seen the disk. He realized that nature had been aware before humans could perceive anything. The forest, the birds, even the rocks, they had all been silent witnesses, alerting him in ways he barely understood. As he approached the trail leading back to the highway, he realized he had to find someone. A witness, someone to confirm what had happened, or at least to ensure he wasn't alone in this experience. The thought of reporting it crossed his mind, but he also felt a hesitation, a subtle fear of disbelief. People might think him reckless, or worse, crazy. Finally, he reached the Trans-Canada Highway. Dust from the forest trail clung to his boots, and the faint scent of sulfur lingered around him. Cars passed by, unaware of the extraordinary encounter that had just taken place in the quiet wilderness behind them. Stefan raised his hand, flagging down a passing vehicle. It was an RCMP patrol car, and he quickly waved, desperate for assistance. The officer, Michalak, pulled over, eyes narrowing as he took in Stefan's disheveled appearance. The burned shirt, the singed cap, the flushed face, and the lingering sulfur odor. All of it spoke louder than words. Stefan leaned slightly out the window, catching his breath. "I need help," he said, voice strained. "There's something in the forest. I don't know what it is, but it burned me." Constable Michalak studied him carefully. His experience told him something unusual had occurred, but he also had to remain professional, logical, and cautious. He asked Stefan to show the burns, but Stefan hesitated, gesturing instead to the briefcase where he had stored his burned shirt. "It's inside," he said, "but you need to see it." By the time Stefan explained as much as he could, the RCMP officer had already observed the lingering sulfur smell, the faint heat in the air, and the precise, unusual burns on his clothing. He began taking notes immediately, recording the location, time, and Stefan's account of the strange disc. It was official documentation, and yet even with the records, the encounter still seemed almost impossible. The forest behind them remained quiet, untouched by human intrusion, the trees and rocks holding the secrets of the landing. The disc had departed silently, yet its presence lingered in every detail. The burns, the heat, the lingering sulfur, and the inexplicable sense of observation that Stefan carried with him. Even as he left the clearing and drove toward medical attention, he could not shake the feeling that the craft had watched him, had somehow interacted with him, had tested the boundaries of what he could endure. The forest, the birds, and the mysterious machine had all played a part in the encounter, leaving him with evidence that would later be scrutinized by experts, scientists, and skeptics alike. As the highway stretched ahead, sunlight filtering through the car windows, Stefan felt a mix of relief, confusion, and lingering awe. He knew he had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would remain unexplained despite investigations, despite evidence, despite the passage of time. And somewhere in the sky above Falcon Lake, the disc continued its journey, silent and precise, leaving behind a man who had glimpsed a machine, or perhaps a presence, beyond ordinary human comprehension. The craft had departed, but the encounter had only just begun to unfold in the life of Stefan Michalak. Chapter 9. The evidence left behind. The forest around Falcon Lake seemed to return to its quiet normalcy after the craft's departure, as though the trees, rocks, and birds had exhaled a collective breath of relief. Yet for Stefan Michalak, the ordinary world felt anything but normal. His body ached from the burns across his chest and abdomen, and a lingering, tingling warmth reminded him that the encounter was far from over. Every nerve seemed to vibrate with residual energy, every thought tangled between disbelief and wonder. By the time he reached the Trans-Canada Highway and flagged down, RCMP Constable Michalak, the first stage of documentation had begun. The officer immediately recognized that this was not a simple accident or minor injury. The faint sulfur smell clung to Stefan's clothing. His singed cap and shirt were evidence enough of unusual heat, and the precise pattern of burns suggested something mechanical, something intentional. After brief questioning, Stefan was escorted to a nearby medical facility. The hospital staff were startled by the grid-like burns across his chest and abdomen. Doctors examined the marks carefully, noting their unusual uniformity and precise alignment. These were not ordinary thermal burns, nor could they be explained by friction, fire from an accident, or chemical exposure. Something far more concentrated had caused them. Something deliberate and mysterious. Stefan described the event as calmly as he could, though even his voice trembled slightly under the weight of what he had experienced. He sketched the disc, the grid-pattern vents, the glowing metallic surface, and the subtle hatch that had opened briefly. His sketches would later become critical pieces of documentation for investigators, illustrating details no one else could have observed. Meanwhile, RCMP officers returned to the clearing at Falcon Lake to examine the site. They documented the location meticulously, photographing the rock outcrop where the disc had landed and taking soil and vegetation samples. The rocks bore faint scorch marks, where the craft's weight and heat had interacted with the surface, and small patches of nearby vegetation were singed in a precise circular pattern, suggesting a concentrated heat source rather than random fire. Even more unusual were the soil samples. In certain spots, the earth retained elevated levels of radiation. Nothing explosive or dangerous had occurred. No debris, no residue. But there was a detectable anomaly in the area where the craft had hovered and landed. Investigators could not explain it with conventional science, and the anomaly added a layer of mystery that deepened the significance of the encounter. Stefan's clothing was analyzed as well. The burned shirt and glove tips that had melted from direct contact with the craft were collected and studied at RCMP labs. The results were astonishing. The burns matched the grid pattern vents perfectly, confirming that the damage was not accidental or imagined. It was precise, measurable, and consistent with Stefan's testimony. The hospital records and ongoing medical follow-ups documented more than just superficial burns. Stefan experienced nausea, dizziness, fatigue, diarrhea, and even noticeable weight loss in the weeks following the encounter. Symptoms consistent with radiation exposure or severe thermal injury were recorded by multiple medical professionals. Each visit, each note reinforced the reality of what had happened. He had physically interacted with something extraordinary, and his body had responded in measurable ways. Investigators were careful, thorough, and skeptical in equal measure. The Royal Canadian Air Force, through the Department of National Defense, examined the site, analyzing soil samples, vegetation, and physical evidence. Civilian UFO research groups, including the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, documented the event extensively, collecting eyewitness statements and preserving photographs, sketches, and soil samples. Thousands of pages of documentation would later be archived at Library and Archives Canada and the University of Manitoba, providing one of the most comprehensive sets of materials ever assembled for a UFO encounter. Even more compelling was Stefan's consistent testimony, though some minor details shifted under the intense scrutiny of repeated questioning. Natural consequence of human memory under stress. The essential elements remained unchanged. The glowing disk, the hovering craft, the hatch, the heat, the vents, the burns. Each corroborated piece of evidence. The burned clothing, the radiation in the soil, the scorched vegetation aligned perfectly with his account. Yet the story was not without skeptics. Some proposed that Stefan had been mistaken, or that he might have fabricated the experience for attention or financial gain. Others speculated about hallucinations, alcohol, or exposure to natural phenomena misinterpreted as extraordinary. But the physical evidence was difficult to dismiss. Precise grid-pattern burns, soil anomalies, residual heat, and radiation. Nothing in the official records suggested trickery. Nothing explained the measurable physical effects. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Falcon Lake encounter was its categorization in UFO research as a close encounter of the second kind. An incident where the witness not only sees an unidentified aerial phenomena, but also experiences physical effects. Such encounters are rare, and even rarer are those supported by corroborating physical evidence and medical documentation. Stefan's case became a benchmark in UFO studies precisely because of this combination. Credible witness, verifiable physical traces, and extensive investigative documentation. Yet even with all this evidence, questions remained. Where had the craft come from? What powered it? Why had it released heat in such a precise, controlled pattern? And most importantly, what or who was inside? Stefan could only speculate. His sketches captured the craft's external features, but they offered no clues about its origin or purpose. The internal mechanisms, if any existed, remained a mystery. As the days passed, the forest around Falcon Lake returned to a semblance of normalcy. Hikers and prospectors wandered the trails, unaware of the extraordinary events that had taken place. The birds returned, flying over the lakes and trees in their familiar patterns. Yet beneath the quiet exterior of the wilderness, the site retained its subtle anomalies: scorched rock, traces of heat, and soil that refused to conform to ordinary measurements. Stefan continued his life with an uneasy sense of awe. He revisited the site occasionally, documenting his observations, taking notes, and reflecting on the encounter. Each visit reminded him of the precise, deliberate actions of the craft, the mysterious energy it had released, and the uncanny way the forest and wildlife had signaled its presence even before he had noticed it. The experience left him with a mixture of wonder, frustration, and respect. He had touched the extraordinary filth hits. He had smelled its sulfur, and survived an encounter that defied explanation. But the craft had left no clues about why it had appeared, why it had tested him, or why it had departed so silently. In the broader world, the Falcon Lake incident became a symbol of unexplained phenomena, an event where ordinary life intersected with something beyond human understanding. It was meticulously documented, investigated, and debated for decades, yet it remained officially unexplained. Experts, skeptics, and enthusiasts alike returned repeatedly to the evidence. Burned clothing, grid pattern welts on Stefan's body, radiation anomalies, and witness testimony that could not easily be dismissed. For Stefan, the encounter was intensely personal. It changed how he viewed the forest, the sky, and the machinery he had once understood so thoroughly. He had been a man of methodical observation, trained to trust logic and evidence, yet he had faced something that stretched the limits of comprehension. He had touched the impossible, survived it, and returned to share what he had experienced. And so, the clearing at Falcon Lake, the burned rock outcrop, and the shimmering disk itself became etched in memory, not just his own, but in the annals of UFO history. Every photograph, sketch, soil sample, and medical report served as a reminder. Some encounters leave behind evidence that challenges what we think we know about the world. Stefan Michalak's life would never be the same. He carried the story, the burns, the residual pain, and the unanswered questions for the rest of his life. Yet he also carried a profound lesson. Even in the ordinary forest, among ordinary rocks and birds, the extraordinary can arrive silently, leave its mark, and vanish just as quietly, leaving humanity to wonder, to investigate, and to imagine. And the evidence, like a whisper in the wind, remained an invitation to see beyond the ordinary, and to question the limits of what we believe is possible. Questions multiplied, but proof demanded more than headlines. It demanded careful, meticulous study. Chapter 10. The investigators arrive. By the time word of the Falcon Lake encounter reached official channels, the atmosphere was thick with curiosity, skepticism, and careful procedural caution. Stefan Michalak had returned from the clearing, burned shirt in briefcase, chest still tingling from the unusual heat, and mind swirling with questions. For him, the forest, the glowing disk, and the lingering sulfur scent were fresh memories, vivid and impossible to forget. For the authorities, it was an anomaly that demanded documentation, verification, and rigorous investigation. Within hours, representatives from multiple agencies had converged on Falcon Lake. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were first on the scene, arriving with notebooks, cameras, and an air of professional detachment. To them, this was a potential hazard, a strange accident, or perhaps even a hoax. Yet, as Stefan recounted his experience, the hovering disk, the hatch, the intense heat, the grid-like burns, the investigator's skepticism began to waver in subtle ways. The Royal Canadian Air Force, through the Department of National Defense, became involved soon after. Their interest was both strategic and scientific. If this was a new aircraft, possibly of foreign origin, it could have implications for national security. Teams of technicians, engineers, and scientific observers documented every detail meticulously. They photographed the rock outcrop, mapped the scorched vegetation, and collected soil samples with sterile precision. Nothing was overlooked, because every trace could hold a clue. Meanwhile, civilian UFO research groups like the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, APRO, also arrived, bringing their own sets of expertise, cameras, and investigative notebooks. Their approach was more holistic, focused not just on physical evidence, but on witness credibility, patterns in the surrounding environment, and anomalies in the flora and fauna. They carefully noted the alignment of burned patches, the exact dimensions of scorch marks, and the subtle heat residuals in the soil. For Stefan, watching these investigators work was surreal. The disk had been gone for hours, but its impact lingered palpably in the clearing. The heat, the sulfur, the precise burn marks, all of it was being recorded, analyzed, and interpreted, transforming his personal encounter into a documented event. For the first time, Stefan understood that this was no longer only his experience, it was entering history, to be examined, debated, and archived for decades to come. One of the most remarkable aspects for the investigators was the physical evidence Stefan had preserved. The burned shirt, the singed gloves, the sketches of the craft. All of these items were crucial in corroborating his account. The grid pattern burns on the clothing were unlike anything produced by ordinary fire or chemical exposure. Tests revealed precise patterns that matched the venti-like design he had drawn of the disc, confirming that the physical effects aligned perfectly with his testimony. Soil and vegetation analysis yielded further anomalies. Circular scorch marks surrounded the landing site. The trees, lower branches, slightly blackened as if brushed by an invisible hand. Samples of the soil showed elevated radiation levels, enough to attract the attention of Canadian military scientists. These anomalies were subtle but undeniable. A silent fingerprint left by the machine that had briefly visited the clearing. The investigators were meticulous, but their work was also cautious. They measured distances, mapped angles, and photographed every rock, leaf, and scorched patch of earth. Even the faint trails Stefan had left in the forest were documented, giving a sense of his movement during the encounter. His footprints, bent grass, and broken twigs became silent witnesses, confirming that someone had been present when the extraordinary event had occurred. As interviews continued, Stefan recounted the moment of the blast, the searing heat, and the sulfur-like scent. Doctors provided medical records of his burns and radiation-like symptoms. Each detail was cross-referenced, creating a web of corroboration that made the case increasingly difficult to dismiss. Yet, despite the growing mountain of evidence, the investigators faced an inherent tension. On one hand, the physical traces burned clothing, soil anomalies, vegetation damage, demanded explanation. On the other hand, the phenomenon itself remained inexplicable within the context of known technology. How could a disc-shaped object hover silently, produce such precise heat effects, and vanish without a trace? Could it really be human-made? Or was it something else entirely? Skepticism was balanced with curiosity. Scientists and engineers debated the plausibility of experimental aircraft, foreign prototypes, or unusual atmospheric phenomena. Every potential explanation was scrutinized, yet none fully accounted for the combination of visual observation, physical injury, and environmental traces. The uniformity of the grid pattern burns, the precise placement of scorched vegetation, and the documented radiation anomalies were anomalies in every sense of the word. Meanwhile, Stefan became both witness and participant in a complex investigation that stretched across multiple agencies and disciplines. He was asked to replicate sketches, confirm details under questioning, and revisit the clearing to verify his memories. Each session reinforced the credibility of his account, even as the questions became more detailed and challenging. The investigators' work extended beyond Falcon Lake. Soil samples were sent to specialized laboratories. Burn patterns were measured and compared with Stefan's clothing. Radiation readings were verified independently. Each data point was meticulously logged, creating a comprehensive dossier that would later be referenced in reports, declassified documents, and scholarly research. For Stefan, the process was exhausting but strangely validating. He had experienced something extraordinary, something that left a tangible mark on both his body and the environment. To see trained professionals document and analyze every detail affirmed the reality of the event. It was no longer a private, inexplicable encounter. It was a documented, verifiable phenomenon that defied conventional understanding. The presence of both military and civilian investigators highlighted another layer of the story. The intersection of ordinary human life with forces beyond comprehension. A simple prospecting trip into the forest had transformed into a multidisciplinary investigation involving law enforcement, the military, scientists, and UFO enthusiasts. It was a rare alignment of attention, expertise, and evidence that would give Falcon Lake its enduring place in history. As days passed, the forest began to return to its quiet rhythm. Birds sang in the distance. Winds rustled the pines. Sunlight reflected off the rocks in familiar patterns. Yet for those who had witnessed the sight, the scorched ground, the burned vegetation, the lingering radiation, the memory of the disk remained vivid. Stefan continued to live with the encounter. He sought medical attention, reported observations, and cooperated with investigators while grappling with the lingering mystery. He understood that what he had experienced could not be easily explained. Yet he also realized that every measurement, every soil sample, every photograph and sketch contributed to a story that would challenge the boundaries of human understanding. The investigators departed eventually, leaving the forest in quiet contemplation, but their records remained. Photographs, diagrams, soil analysis, and medical reports ensured that the Falcon Lake encounter would not vanish into rumor or myth. Every piece of evidence preserved the moment, the disk, the burns, the heat, and the silent intelligence of the machine. For Stefan, the experience left a lasting mark. The forest, the rocks, the clearing, and the disk itself had become part of a narrative that extended far beyond his personal life. The investigation, meticulous and rigorous, had transformed what began as a personal encounter into a documented phenomena that challenged human knowledge and inspired inquiry. And in the quiet of the forest, long after the investigators had gone, the clearing retained the subtle traces of that extraordinary day. Scorched earth, bent grass, and the faint memory of a glowing, silent machine that had arrived, hovered, tested, and departed, leaving both Stefan and the world with questions that had no easy answers. Falcon Lake was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a crossroads between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Chapter 11. The Media Storm. News travels fast in the modern world, but in 1967, information had its own rhythm. For Stefan Michalak, the days following his encounter at Falcon Lake were filled not only with pain from the burns and lingering fatigue, but also with a growing awareness that his story would not remain private. The physical evidence, the RCMP reports, and the glowing disk itself had already drawn official attention. And now word began to spread beyond the forest clearing into the wider world. It started subtly. Local newspapers caught wind of an unusual incident. A man claiming burns from a mysterious machine in the remote wilderness east of Winnipeg. For residents of Falcon Lake and Whiteshell Provincial Park, it was initially just another odd story, something that might be exaggerated or misunderstood. But the details: grid pattern burns on a man's clothing, radiation anomalies at the site, scorched vegetation, and sketches of a disc-shaped craft set the story apart from ordinary wilderness accidents. Soon reporters were calling, curious and persistent. They wanted photographs of the burned clothing, sketches of the craft, interviews with Stefan, and statements from RCMP officers. Stefan, a man of practical work and scientific interest, found himself in an unfamiliar world of camera flashes and notebook scribbles. The media demanded stories, explanations, and sometimes even speculation. Some articles leaned towards skepticism. Headlines questioned Stefan's credibility, suggesting misidentification, hallucination, or even a hoax to gain attention. Others approached with fascination, portraying the event as a true mystery that defied conventional science. The contrasting narratives made Stefan uneasy. He knew the truth of what he had experienced. The heat, the sulfur smell, the hovering disk. But communicating that to the public without exaggeration proved difficult. Photographers visited his home to document the burned clothing and gloves. Reporters asked him to recount the story repeatedly, and each telling carried the risk of distortion. Stefan's initial sketches, submitted to investigators, were reproduced in newspapers, showing the disk's grid-like vents, metallic sheen, and subtle glow. These images became central to the public discussion, giving the story a visual anchor that was impossible to ignore. The public reaction was intense. Letters poured into newspapers from readers expressing curiosity, disbelief, fear, and fascination. People speculated about extraterrestrial visitors, secret military technology, or natural phenomena that had been misinterpreted. Some believed Stefan immediately, impressed by the consistency of his testimony and the physical evidence. Others remained doubtful, pointing to the unusual nature of the burns or suggesting a misadventure in the woods. Stefan's experience had unexpectedly become a bridge between the ordinary world and the extraordinary. A man who had spent his life prospecting in the forest was suddenly at the center of a story that would ripple across Canada and beyond. His daily routines, working with machinery, tending to his home, spending time with family, were now interwoven with interviews, investigations, and the growing curiosity of the public. Medical professionals were also drawn into the media narrative. The precise documentation of Stefan's burns, weight loss, and radiation-like symptoms provided concrete evidence for journalists seeking facts. Doctors described the unusual grid-pattern welts, confirming that they could not be explained by ordinary fire or accident. This medical corroboration lent credibility to the story and fueled public fascination. Government officials responded carefully. The Department of National Defense and the Royal Canadian Air Force maintained their investigative stance, while also managing the narrative to avoid panic or misinformation. Statements acknowledged the incident without speculating on its origin, highlighting the need for rigorous scientific evaluation. This official caution, however, only added to public intrigue. Why the secrecy? What was being withheld? People began imagining scenarios from secret experiments to extraterrestrial contact. For Stefan, the media storm was exhausting. Each interview, each retelling of the encounter, forced him to relive the moment, the heat, the sulfur, the grid pattern burns, and the silent, obering disk. Yet he also recognized the opportunity. By sharing his experience, he contributed to a larger discussion about the unexplained and the mysterious. His story would not simply be anecdotal. It would become part of a documented history, studied, debated, and referenced for decades. Despite the public attention, not all reactions were sympathetic. Some journalists sensationalized the story, focusing on UFO tropes and speculation about aliens, rather than the detailed physical evidence. Stefan found this frustrating. He wanted the truth examined, not exaggerated. He wanted the burns, the soil anomalies, the scorched vegetation, and the medical documentation to be understood as serious, tangible phenomena. Meanwhile, international UFO researchers took notice. Groups from the United States, Europe, and beyond contacted Stefan, seeking more detailed accounts, photographs, and official reports. The Falcon Lake incident was rapidly gaining a reputation as one of the most credible and well-documented cases in the world. Its combination of a reliable witness, physical traces, medical documentation, and multiple investigative agencies set it apart from most other reports. Even decades later, the media coverage would remain central to the story's legacy. Newspapers, television programs, and later documentaries would revisit Falcon Lake repeatedly, analyzing every sketch, every photograph, and every investigative record. The public fascination with the story endured because it was not simply a tale of lights in the sky. It was a documented intersection of human experience and an unexplained phenomenon with physical consequences. For Stefan personally, the attention brought both challenges and validation. His life had been ordinary, predictable, rooted in work, family, and quiet forested landscapes. Now he was at the center of a story that blurred the line between ordinary human experience and the extraordinary unknown. The media storm forced him to navigate credibility, skepticism, and personal safety, while also protecting his family from unwanted intrusion. Yet in the midst of the attention, the forest and the clearing at Falcon Lake remained untouched, holding the traces of the encounter silently. The scorched rock, bent vegetation, and subtle radiation anomalies stood as mute witnesses to the event. No amount of news coverage, speculation, or public curiosity could erase the fact that something extraordinary had occurred. The media storm with all its intensity, also cemented Falcon Lake in the cultural imagination. It was no longer simply a local incident. It became a national story, a case study in how a credible encounter could ripple through official, scientific, and public channels. The combination of physical evidence, medical documentation, and the steadfast witness created a foundation that would influence ufology for decades to come. And for Stefan, amidst the camera flashes, interviews, and articles, one thought remained. The craft had come and gone, silent and precise, leaving behind burns, heat, and a story that demanded both attention and careful reflection. What had he seen? Where had it come from? And why had it left such a perfect, measurable imprint on his life and the forest itself? Falcon Lake had captured the world's attention, and Stefan Michalak had become the unlikely bridge between the ordinary and the extraordinary, a witness to a mystery that refused to fade into legend. Chapter 12. The Scientific Analysis. After the media storm had subsided, the Falcon Lake incident entered a new, more methodical phase, one governed by science, measurement, and meticulous investigation. Stefan Michalak, still recovering from the burns that had marked his chest and abdomen, found himself at the center of a careful study by medical professionals, engineers, and scientists. From multiple disciplines, the encounter had left physical traces, and now those traces would speak louder than words. The first step was the medical documentation. Doctors meticulously recorded the grit pattern burns that had formed on Stefan's torso. These were not ordinary burns, not even close. Each welting aligned perfectly with the sketch of the vents on the underside of the disc. Raised, circular patterns marked the points of contact, leaving a permanent imprint that would be referenced in every subsequent investigation. Pain, redness, and tenderness accompanied these marks, but it was the precision that fascinated medical observers. How could heat, applied so suddenly and without contact beyond the blast, produce such an organized, almost mechanical pattern? Stefan's symptoms went beyond superficial injuries. Over the following weeks, he experienced nausea, dizziness, fatigue, and diarrhea. He lost a noticeable amount of weight, approximately 20 pounds, which puzzled physicians. Laboratory tests revealed no conventional cause. There was no poisoning, no infection, no trace of chemical agents. The combination of burns, physical weakness, and systemic symptoms suggested exposure to something unusual, possibly radiation, though of a type and intensity that defied standard measurement. Medical professionals documented these findings extensively, and some sent samples for consultation at specialized facilities. The Mayo Clinic, among others, provided second opinions. Their reports noted recurring burn episodes, persistent fatigue, and a pattern of healing that did not match typical thermal injuries. Stefan's body, it seemed, had recorded the encounter in ways that defied easy explanation. Meanwhile, physical scientists and engineers turned to the clearing itself. Soil samples were analyzed, revealing elevated radiation levels precisely at the points where the disk had hovered and landed. Nearby vegetation showed signs of scorching in a circular pattern, consistent with a dispersal of heat from a hovering object. The rock outcrop bore faint scorch marks, as though energy had pressed against it, leaving subtle but measurable impressions. Clothing and equipment became essential pieces of evidence. Stefan's burned shirt and glove tips were examined under laboratory conditions. The heat patterns matched the sketches he had made, confirming that the burns were neither accidental nor artificially produced. The precision grid suggested an energy source with extraordinary control event or exhaust designed to release heat in uniform increments. Engineers and physicists struggled to reconcile these observations with the capabilities of 1967 technology. No experimental aircraft of the era could produce such controlled, localized thermal effects while hovering silently in a forest clearing. Experts also examined the atmospheric conditions. The day had been clear, calm, and warm. Ordinary for a Victoria Day long weekend, there were no storms, lightning, or unusual weather patterns that could account for flashes of heat or light. Even the wildlife, which had reacted initially to the craft's presence, returned to normal behavior after its departure. Nature itself seemed to confirm that the phenomenon had been extraordinary but singular, leaving behind evidence only in its interaction with Stefan and the environment. Investigators debated the possibility of human-made technology. Could this have been an experimental aircraft from the United States or elsewhere? Perhaps a top-secret military prototype. The arguments had merit on the surface, but every technical detail contradicted conventional engineering. A machine of that size, approximately 35 to 40 feet wide, based on Stefan's sketches, hovering silently, producing controlled heat, and leaving radiation traces, was beyond the capabilities of known human designs. Skeptics proposed alternate explanations: hallucinations, alcohol, or misidentification. Yet these theories faltered under scrutiny. Stefan's account was consistent across multiple interviews. His burns were verified by medical professionals, and the physical traces in the forest, soil, rock, and vegetation corroborated his story. No hallucination could leave soil with measurable radiation or scorch plants in circular patterns. No misjudged courts of aim could account for burns in a precise grid. Even decades later, the Falcon Lake evidence continued to fascinate. Soil samples and photographs remained archived in Library and Archives Canada, accessible to scientists seeking to study anomalies with modern technology. Stefan's clothing and sketches provided a tangible reference point for a comparison with other reports. The incident became a touchstone in the study of close encounters of the second kind, cases where witnesses not only see something extraordinary but also experience physical effects. For Stefan, the scientific analysis offered both reassurance and DOA. The burns, the residual symptoms, and the environmental traces were now part of a documented, verifiable record. They confirmed that his encounter had not been imagined or exaggerated. At the same time, the analysis deepened the mystery. The precise energy patterns, the hovering craft, the controlled thermal output, and the lingering radiation all pointed to something beyond ordinary human capability. Laboratory reports, official memoranda, and declassified documents later revealed the complexity of the investigation. Hundreds of pages detailed soil studies, medical observations, witness interviews, and correspondence between Canadian authorities and the U.S. Air Force. Each piece of documentation contributed to a growing body of evidence that placed Falcon Lake among the most credible UFO cases in history. The scientific analysis also brought an unexpected human dimension. Stefan's experience was not abstract. It was personal. He had been burned, weakened, and challenged by forces he could not comprehend. Yet the rigor of the investigation transformed that personal encounter into a universal question. What are the limits of human knowledge? And how should we respond when faced with phenomena that defy conventional understanding? Even in the quiet of his own home, Stefan reflected on the analytical process. Doctors, engineers, and scientists had examined every detail, yet they still could not explain the craft's origin, purpose, or technology. The more he learned from their findings, the more he realized how little humans truly understood about the broader universe. Falcon Lake had become a case study in observation, documentation, and curiosity. It demonstrated the importance of careful evidence collection, rigorous testing, and maintaining an open mind. While pursuing the truth, the burns on Stefan's body, the scorched earth, and the soil anomalies were not just data points. They were proof that the extraordinary and could intersect with ordinary life in measurable, undeniable ways. The scientific analysis, while thorough and meticulous, did not provide closure. It offered explanation, validation, and credibility, but it did not answer the ultimate question. What had Stefan Michalak encountered in that forest clearing? The craft, the precise heat, and the lingering effects remained a mystery. The evidence was real, measurable, and consistent, but the phenomenon itself was still beyond explanation. And so, Falcon Lake remained a place where science and wonder met, where careful measurement intersected with the unknowable, and where one man's encounter had become a lasting enigma. The investigation documented everything, but in documenting it, it also invited deeper questions. Questions about the universe, the limits of human understanding, and the possibility that some mysteries are meant to challenge us, to expand our curiosity, and to remind us that the world contains forces still beyond our comprehension. In the end, the analysis confirmed one truth above all. Stefan Michalak had not imagined the craft, the heat, or the burns. The evidence endured, silent and compelling, a bridge between human observation and the unknown. Even with data and measurements in hand, the forest held its secrets. and Stefan's mind returned to questions no lab could answer. Chapter 13. Lasting Questions. Even as the forests of Falcon Lake returned to their tranquil rhythm, Stefan Michalak's life, and the world's perception of the incident, had been irreversibly changed. The shimmering disk, the blast of heat, and the precise grid pattern burns had left more than physical marks. They had left a trail of questions that would ripple far beyond a single forest clearing in Manitoba. In the weeks and months after the encounter, discussions about Falcon Lake became more than just local conversation or newspaper curiosity. Experts, scientists, journalists, and UFO enthusiasts debated what had happened, each bringing their own perspective, each searching for answers in the fragments of evidence Stefan had provided. And yet, for all the investigation, laboratory tests, and official reports, one central truth persisted. No explanation fully accounted for every detail of the encounter. Some skeptics argued that the incident was a hoax, or that Stefan had been mistaken in his recollection. Perhaps he had misinterpreted natural phenomena, or perhaps stress and fatigue had magnified the ordinary into the extraordinary. But every counter-argument struggled against the weight of physical evidence. The burned shirt with its perfect grid pattern, the melted glove tips, the radiation anomalies in the soil, and the scorched vegetation arranged in circular precision. Even those most skeptical could not explain how these traces aligned so accurately with Stefan's sketches and testimony. Medical records offered another layer of mystery. The grid pattern welts on Stefan's chest and abdomen were documented by multiple doctors over time, and his ongoing symptoms, fatigue, nausea, weight loss, persisted in ways that mirrored radiation exposure, though no conventional source had been identified. Here was a man whose body had recorded the encounter in detail, leaving a physiological signature that resisted ordinary explanation. As the years passed, the Falcon Lake incident became a touchstone in the study of close encounters of the second kind. Researchers around the world cited Stefan's experience as one of the most credible examples of a UFO encounter leaving tangible, measurable evidence. Soil samples were revisited, laboratory photographs studied, and archival records cross-checked. Each revisit to the data brought new insights, but no ultimate answers. Stefan himself continued to live with the consequences. The burns never fully healed, and the memory of the encounter lingered in both mind and body. He described a mixture of awe and unease, a recognition that the ordinary world of rocks, trees, and clear skies had briefly intersected with something extraordinary and entirely unknowable. Even in the quiet moments, when the forest seemed still and the sun sparkled across Falcon Lake's surface, he could feel the memory of the craft, its silent presence, and the strange heat that had touched him. Yet despite these personal effects, there was also a profound lesson in the encounter: the importance of curiosity, observation, and careful documentation. Stefan's calm attention to detailed sketches, soil samples, and medical follow-up had transformed a fleeting moment of extraordinary experience into a lasting record that scholars, scientists, and investigators could study. It was a rare intersection where personal observation met rigorous methodology, where wonder and evidence coexisted. The debates surrounding Falcon Lake also illuminated a human tension: the desire for closure versus the acceptance of mystery. Many wished for definitive answers, proof of extraterrestrial origin, secret military technology, or some rational explanation that could neatly resolve the questions. But the enduring fascination of Falcon Lake lies precisely in its refusal to conform to expectations. It challenges observers to embrace uncertainty, to recognize the limits of human understanding, and to approach the unknown with both rigor and humility. In time, Falcon Lake influenced not only UFO research, but also public imagination. Books were written, documentaries produced, and academic papers published. Stefan's story became emblematic of a broader human curiosity: the question of what lies beyond the familiar, the known, and the observable. It inspired inquiries into other incidents: Rendlesham Forest, the Phoenix Lights, and countless unexplained aerial phenomena, reminding researchers and the public alike that some encounters leave marks that outlast immediate perception. For the scientific community, Falcon Lake was both a case study and a challenge. It demanded careful measurement, cross-disciplinary analysis, and open-minded interpretation. No single field could claim complete understanding. Physics, medicine, and environmental science Each provided pieces of the puzzle, yet the whole remained tantalizingly beyond reach. And for Stefan Michalak, the encounter remained deeply personal. He had not sought fame or attention. He had sought quartz in the quiet forest, only to be met by an event that defied description. The burns on his body and the traces in the environment became more than evidence. They were reminders that life can intersect with the extraordinary in ways that leave permanent marks. He carried that lesson forward with quiet dignity, aware that the forest, the rocks, and even the invisible energy of the disk were now woven into the fabric of his existence. Falcon Lake endures not as a definitive answer to humanity's questions about the unknown, but as a symbol of curiosity, courage, and meticulous observation. It reminds us that some mysteries are meant to be studied, documented, and shared, even when the ultimate truth remains elusive. And so the clearing, the scorched rocks, and the shimmering traces of energy remain as silent witnesses. Stefan's testimony, medical records, and the meticulous investigations serve as a bridge, connecting human experience to the mysteries of the cosmos, inviting us to look deeper, question more, and remain humble before the universe's possibilities. The craft may have vanished into the sky, but Falcon Lake remains a quiet, enduring reminder that the extraordinary can touch the ordinary world, leaving questions that inspire wonder for generations to come. And as the years passed, the ripples of Falcon Lake extended beyond Stefan, touching lives, minds, and imaginations far and wide. Chapter 14. Reflections and Ripples. Years passed, and the forests of Whiteshell Provincial Park settled back into their quiet rhythm, their pine-scented air and sparkling lakes seemingly untouched by the extraordinary events that had unfolded in 1967. Yet for Stefan Michalak, the echoes of that day never faded. Every breeze through the pines, every distant bird call, every glint of sunlight on a rock carried him back to the moment when the hovering disk had silently entered his world and left its invisible fingerprints behind in the years after the incident. Stefan often found himself reflecting quietly on the encounter, both its immediate sensations and its lasting consequences. He remembered the sudden eruption of geese, the blast of heat from the craft, and the sulfuric smell that had lingered in the clearing. These sensory imprints were vivid, like a recording playing softly at the edge of memory, reminding him that he had experienced something extraordinary yet wholly inexplicable. His reflections were not always easy. The burns on his chest and abdomen never fully healed. They flared occasionally in a grid-like reminder of what had touched him. Fatigue and intermittent symptoms followed him for years, shaping his daily life in subtle but persistent ways. Every doctor's visit and every medical report reinforced the reality of the encounter, but they also served as reminders of the uncertainty that lingered. Science could measure anomalies, document patterns, and verify injuries, yet it could not answer the larger question. What had Stefan truly seen? Over time, he began to notice the subtle ways the incident had rippled into the lives of others. Researchers, journalists, and enthusiasts used the Falcon Lake case as a benchmark for credible UFO encounters. Students of ufology studied the photographs, soil analysis, and medical records. Debates arose in scholarly journals, conferences, and informal circles. What had once been a personal ordeal became part of a collective exploration, a puzzle that invited inquiry and imagination. Even Stefan's own family felt the reverberations. His son, Stan, grew up knowing that his father had witnessed something extraordinary, something that could not be neatly explained or dismissed. Together, they documented memories, sketches, and notes, ultimately co-authoring when they appeared, preserving both the facts and the human story behind them. For the Michalak family, Falcon Lake was more than a location on a map. It was a touchstone of curiosity, resilience, and the unknown that had shaped their lives. Public fascination also lingered. The incident was covered repeatedly in newspapers, documentaries, and later television programs exploring unexplained phenomena. Each retelling revisited the precision of the grid burns, the hovering craft, and the unusual environmental traces. The story captured the imagination not only of UFO enthusiasts but also of ordinary people, bridging the gap between everyday life and the mysteries that exist beyond immediate perception. Culturally, Falcon Lake became a symbol of the unexplained intersecting with the familiar. It illustrated that ordinary routines, prospecting in a quiet forest, walking along a lakeside trail, could suddenly intersect with something extraordinary. The incident challenged assumptions. inviting people to remain curious and open-minded. It inspired both scientific and imaginative exploration, encouraging observers to look at the world with a sense of wonder tempered by critical thinking. For Stefan, reflection often returned to the simplest questions. Why him? Why that day? Why that forest clearing? The craft had hovered silently, released heat in a precise pattern, and departed without explanation. It had left marks in both the environment and his own body. It offered no insight into purpose, origin, or intent. These unanswered questions became part of the legacy, an enduring ripple that encouraged inquiry rather than resolution. He also reflected on the human aspect of the encounter. He had faced disbelief, skepticism, and media scrutiny. Yet through it all, he maintained a quiet dignity, sharing his experience with honesty and precision. The investigators, scientists, and journalists who interacted with him were forced to confront something that did not fit conventional understanding. Stefan realized that credibility, calm, observation, and patience were powerful tools in a world that often sought quick answers to complex mysteries. The ripple effects of Falcon Lake extended beyond Stefan and his family. Other UFO cases, particularly those involving physical evidence and close encounters of the second kind, were evaluated in light of his experience. Researchers compared soil samples, vegetation damage, and witness testimony. Falcon Lake became a benchmark, a model of how careful documentation could preserve the extraordinary in ways that were scientifically and culturally meaningful. Even decades later, as new technologies emerged, satellite imaging, AI-assisted data analysis, and global UAP tracking systems, Stefan's encounter remained relevant. It reminded both scientists and the public that some phenomena could leave subtle but verifiable traces, bridging the gap between anecdote and measurable reality. His experience became a touchstone in discussions about credibility, methodology, and the importance of evidence in exploring the unknown. Amid all the reflection and ripples, Stefan found moments of quiet peace. Walking in the woods, feeling the soft crunch of pine needles underfoot, or watching the sunlight shimmer across Falcon Lake, he sensed the invisible threads that connected him to that extraordinary day. The forest, the rocks, and even the lingering questions were part of a larger story. A story that extended beyond him, beyond time, and into the realm of wonder. In these quiet moments, he realized that the encounter had not only changed his life, but also enriched the broader human understanding of possibility. It had provided a lesson in humility, that even in a world measured by science, charts, and logic, there exist phenomena that invite curiosity and deep reflection. The ripples of Falcon Lake also reinforced the value of careful observation. Every detail Stefan recorded: the precise pattern of burns, the sketches of the disk, the photographs, and soil samples had become essential to understanding the encounter. Without his meticulous documentation, the case might have been dismissed or forgotten. Instead, it became a cornerstone of credible ufology, an example of how personal experience, rigor, and integrity can illuminate the extraordinary. And so, Falcon Lake continues to whisper its story, not in loud proclamations or sensational headlines, but in subtle traces: the scorched rocks, bent vegetation, lingering soil anomalies, and the meticulously archived evidence of a man who faced the unknown with courage and clarity. Each ripple extends outward, inviting us to wonder, to question, and to remain humble before the vast mysteries that surround us. Stefan's reflections remind us that the extraordinary need not be terrifying, nor the unknown a threat. It can simply be an invitation to observe carefully, to document faithfully, and to remain open to experiences that stretch the boundaries of understanding. The craft may have vanished long ago, but its influence lingers, not just in soil or scars, but in the curiosity and courage of those willing to witness, study, and reflect. In the hush of the forest and the shimmer of the lake, the story of Falcon Lake invited one last quiet reflection. Chapter 15. Into the quiet beyond. As the years drifted onward, the forests of Whiteshell Provincial Park seemed untouched by time, their tranquil lakes reflecting clouds and sunlight with serene consistency, their dense pines whispering softly in the wind. And yet, beneath this quiet, Falcon Lake held a secret that refused to fade: a memory of fire, heat, and a hovering craft, etched into rocks, soil, and the body of the man who had stood at its edge. Stefan Michalak carried that memory with him every day, not as a burden, but as a reminder that the world could hold the extraordinary even in the most ordinary moments. Even decades later, he could close his eyes and see it clearly. The sudden disturbance of geese fleeing into the sky, the red-orange glow of the disk hovering silently above the rocky outcrop, the hiss and blast of heat that had scorched his clothing and marked his chest. The sulfur-like scent lingered, even if only in memory, and the faint grid pattern burns on his torso told a story of precision, of something deliberate and otherworldly. It was not just a memory of sight and touch, it was a memory etched into the rhythm of his life. In the quiet moments, Stefan often walked near the lake, letting the cool water lap against his boots and listening to the wind ripple across the pine needles. The forest felt alive in subtle ways, as though it retained echoes of that day, as though the extraordinary could leave traces beyond human perception. Birds flew overhead, rocks glinted in the sunlight, and small waves shimmered in patterns that felt almost deliberate. In these moments, the memory of the craft felt less like a singular event and more like a whisper from the world itself. A reminder that mystery is never far away if one pays attention. The investigations, the scientific analysis, and the media coverage had long since receded into history, but the lessons of Falcon Lake endured. Stefan's careful documentation, the burned clothing, soil anomalies, and photographs became a treasure trove for researchers who sought to understand unexplained phenomena with rigor and respect. The case became a standard for credible encounters, cited repeatedly in scholarly papers and documentaries, referenced in discussions of physical effects, and studied alongside other legendary events like Rendlesham Forest and the Phoenix Lights. Yet the true resonance of Falcon Lake was not only in records or reports, it was in the way it touched the imagination, stirred curiosity, and reminded humans that the world is larger than what can be measured, captured, or fully understood. Stefan himself had learned to live with the questions tilling head and why of the encounter, and in that acceptance, he discovered a form of peace. Some mysteries are not solved. They are observed, respected, and reflected upon. His family shared in this quiet understanding. His son Stan, who had grown up aware of the extraordinary experience that marked his father's life, helped preserve the story in when they appeared, ensuring that the human dimension, the fear, wonder, and courage, was never lost amid charts, photographs, and scientific papers. Together, they maintained the balance between evidence and narrative, between the rigor of investigation and the openness of imagination. In the broader world, Falcon Lake's legacy rippled in subtle yet powerful ways. New generations of researchers approached unexplained phenomena with a sense of balance, skepticism informed by science, curiosity tempered by observation, and an openness to possibilities that transcend conventional understanding. Stefan's encounter remained a touchstone, a reminder that close encounters are not merely stories of lights in the sky, but experiences that can leave measurable traces, provoke reflection, and inspire deeper inquiry. Even today, as satellites scan the skies and AI algorithms analyze patterns of aerial anomalies, the lessons of Falcon Lake remain relevant. A forest clearing, scorched rocks, burned clothing, and a human witness continue to serve as reminders that extraordinary events can intersect ordinary lives in ways that challenge assumptions, spark wonder, and invite quiet reflection. Stefan often thought of the craft not as a threat, but as a messenger of possibility. It hovered silently, released heat with precision, and left without fanfare, leaving behind evidence, but no answers. And in that silence lay a profound lesson. The universe holds more than can be fully grasped, and some experiences are meant to expand awareness rather than provide closure. On calm evenings, he would sit by the lakeshore, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the water in streaks of gold and violet. The forest seemed to breathe with him, quiet and eternal. And in that quiet, the memory of the craft felt less like an intrusion and more like a companion. The mystery was not something to be conquered, but something to live alongside, to observe, reflect, and honor. And so, Falcon Lake endures, not just as a place, but as an idea. It is a reminder that ordinary landscapes can host extraordinary moments, that human experience can intersect with forces beyond comprehension, and that the evidence of such encounters, however subtle, deserves attention, respect, and wonder. The disk may have vanished into the sky long ago, leaving only scorched earth, grid pattern burns, and faint radiation traces. Yet its presence continues in the questions it inspires, the curiosity it awakens, and the quiet, reflective moments it gives to those willing to look, listen, and imagine. Stefan Michalak's story concludes not with answers, but with reflection. It is a story of courage, careful observation, and enduring mystery, a reminder that the extraordinary is often gentle, subtle, and patient. And as night falls over the forest, the lake, and the clearing, the quiet beyond seems to whisper the same lesson that Stefan learned long ago. The universe is vast. It is full of wonders, and some mysteries are meant to be felt, remembered, and honored, even if they remain just beyond reach. The story of Falcon Lake ends here, in the hush of the forest and the quiet of memory, leaving space for imagination, reflection, and awe. Whisper of the unknown. And so, our journey through Falcon Lake comes to a gentle pause. The forest grows quiet once more. The ripples of the lake fade into stillness, and the wind sighs softly through the pines, as if carrying secrets too vast for words. Stefan Michalak. This encounter, with its heat, its light, and its lingering mystery, remains a reminder that the world is larger than our eyes can see, richer than our minds can fully grasp. Some questions will never be answered. The craft, whatever it was, departed without explanation. Yet the marks it left, the burns, the scorched earth, the subtle radiation, and the indelible memory, speak in a language of wonder, curiosity, and quiet awe. It reminds us that the extraordinary does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers, waiting for those who are patient enough to notice. Perhaps the true gift of Falcon Lake is not proof, but perspective. It teaches us to observe carefully, to respect evidence, and to carry both skepticism and openness in our hearts. It asks us to hold mystery gently, to let questions linger without forcing answers, and to recognize that the universe is far more intricate, subtle, and beautiful than we can ever fully know. As night falls over the lake, and the stars begin to shimmer in the sky above, imagine the stillness of the clearing, the quiet hum of unseen energy, and the enduring trace of a moment that touched both the earth and a human soul. The extraordinary exists quietly, patiently, inviting us to wonder, reflect, and dream. And in that soft, infinite space between curiosity and understanding, we are reminded some mysteries are not puzzles to be solved, but stories to live with, to honor, and to let guide the imagination, forever whispering of what lies just beyond the edge of knowing. Good night, and may your dreams carry you gently into the quiet beyond, where wonder waits, patient and eternal. If this story helped you drift into the unknown, like, subscribe, and share for more quiet journeys beyond the stars, because the next encounter might be waiting in your dreams.